Why? I said, turning back to her. She was in a white dressing gown that revealed most of her white thighs. She looked wonderful. It looks scary. You think? I could watch it all night, I said. Come away and kiss me, she said. I walked towards her and kissed her lips. I felt skin on my hands and our tongues danced. Wait. Go have a shower. I'll be waiting in bed, she said. I took myself into the ensuite bathroom and got undressed. I slid across the pane of frosted glass and turned on the warm water. I embraced the refreshment, then watched the frosted glass turn beige and something move. Elizabeth entered, wearing only a smile. After, both cleansed in more senses than one, we laid in bed. Her head rested on my chest, and her eyes were closed. Do you think my family is weird? She said. No. But we are, she said. Your family is different, that's all. And I don't think your brother likes me. Ignore Dwight. He's never really grown up, never really had a friend, never really left this place. He was homeschooled and doesn't really like the outside world. Your father's quite hard on him, I said. Yeah, always teases him. It's ridiculous. Always putting him down, she said. Is he always like that on him? Yeah, and he gets worse every year. Dwight's not gay, just shy. If I was honest, I would say he comes across as having serious emotional problems, she said. Maybe he should talk to someone about it, I said. He needs professional help, a psychiatrist. But mother and father can't see the problem. I think they need psychiatric help as well, she said. I didn't say anything, but I thought it could be true. Whatever they do say over this weekend, please don't take them too seriously. Remember, I am me. I'm not them. It's why I spend so much time alone, I think. Like the time you met me, said Elizabeth. I kissed her forehead and watched her wonderful smile as her eyes stayed closed. I want to stay with you tonight, but I'm going back to my own room. Show the respect, you know. If you get thirsty in the night, go to the main kitchen. There are bottles of water in the fridge. And there'll be food in there if you get hungry. Honestly, just help yourself, she said. I'll bear this in mind. Good night, she said, kissing my lips and leaving the room, making the bed feel much bigger. I woke up around 3 a.m. This is quite usual for me, and I have read it's the same for many people. My mouth was particularly dry after the red wine. I got out of bed and put on some tracksuit bottoms and a t-shirt and glanced out the window. Lake Windermere almost took my breath away. I took tentative steps into the landing. It was dark, but a light from downstairs provided enough illumination, acting as a beacon of where to go. I made my way downstairs and passed beneath the chandelier in the foyer. My bare feet felt cold on the marble floor, and I walked to where I knew the kitchen would be. Like the rest of the house, it was big. An island was situated in the middle, something I wasn't used to seeing. I passed the bread bin and the kitchen knives, and opened the fridge, which was the size of a wardrobe, and the light hit me and spilled into the room. My eyes adjusted, and in the door compartment there were dozens of glass water bottles. I took one, shut the door, and in the darkness drank my prize. As I did, a cool breeze hit my arm. It felt unusual. For a moment, I wondered if it was just because the house was so large it might carry its own breeze. But as I felt it again, stronger this time, I knew that would be preposterous. Somewhere, a door was open. I followed the breeze, out the kitchen, and looked down a long corridor where lamplights lined the wall. At the bottom of the corridor, I could see a door was open, where the breeze came from, and I wondered if someone had left the door open by mistake. Slowly, I walked down the room and peered into the doorway. I was looking at an office. There were 2 bookshelves, one occupying the whole left wall and one on the right wall, and in front was a big oak table with an old globe on it and a lamp. Behind the desk was a door open. The curtains danced in the cold wind, and just beyond someone sat in the night, alone in a chair. "Mr. Lacey?" I called out. The shadowy figure moved slightly, and I heard the contents of a glass bottle being consumed and put on the concrete floor beside them. "What are you doing here?" It was the voice of Dwight. "Dwight, I woke up in the night and needed some water. I wonder where the draft was coming from. I just wanted to make sure everything was okay," I said. "Everything is okay. Honestly. You should go back from where you came from." "What do you mean?" "Your bedroom. Or have you been sleeping in my sister's room?" "No, the spare room. Is everything okay? I sense a lot of hostility coming from you." He looked up, and I could see the outlining of his face from the little light that came from the corridor. The expression from the dining table exposed itself once again. My eyes had adjusted, and I could see he sat in a garden chair. By his feet was a half-empty bottle of whiskey. On his lap was a shotgun. "Dwight, why do you have a gun?" I said. "You're not in the city anymore now, boy," said Dwight. "What?" "Sometimes I shoot things." "Okay," I said. It was then he picked up a pair of binoculars and looked towards the lake, like he was fixated on one point. "What are you looking for? Must be difficult to see at night." "That's none of your fucking business," said Dwight. I said nothing, and slowly turned away, out of the library and back down the corridor. As I walked up the stairs, I just then realized how weird what just happened was. "15. The next morning I was woke early by Elizabeth. She crawled into the bed with me, and I remember the room being surprisingly bright. "Morning, sleepyhead." "Morning," I said with a rough voice while stretching. "Sleep well?" "Not bad, thank you. What time is it?" "About 7. I wanted a bit of time with you before breakfast at 8. "Really?" "Yeah. Abigail and Frederick will have everything ready for us," she said. "Bloody hell. Them guys work some long hours." "Never mind about them," said Elizabeth. It was at that moment I remembered last night and her brother with the shotgun. At first, I thought it was a dream. It became a nightmare when I realized it wasn't. "Elizabeth?" "Yeah?" "I saw something strange last night." "What do you mean?" "Your brother," I said. "Oh dear, what's he done now?" "I saw him with a gun." "Oh yeah, he's always carrying that thing around," said Elizabeth. "What?" "You say it like it's so blasé. It's a gun, for God's sake." "Relax. Sometimes he goes shooting, that's all." "Okay, fine, but casually carrying it around in the night, drunk?" "Oh, whatever. What do you want for breakfast?" said Elizabeth. I was shocked by how little she cared about the gun. Then I thought, maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was more normal in the countryside. "Well, I wouldn't say no to a full English," I said. "A full English it is then," she said. It wasn't long before I was showered and sat at the table for breakfast. When I walked into the room that morning, everything felt so much more relaxed than the night before. Her father was with the morning paper. He held it wide open at the end of the table and chewed on a bit of toast, dressed in red chinos and a white shirt ready for the day. Her mother sat in a silk dressing gown, drinking orange juice, staring lazily into the distance. "Here she is, the most beautiful daughter in the world, yes, indeed, accompanied by the not-so-handsome, not-so-ugly Mr. Saturn. How did you sleep, sir?" Very well, sir," I said, taking a seat. "No need for such formalities. Please, call me Mr. Lacey. What will you be having?" "Good morning, father. I and Daniel will be having the full works," said Elizabeth, sitting beside me. "Indeed. Abigail, get out here this instant," shouted Mr. Lacey. With such ferocity, I had to remind myself to close my mouth from a gasp. Abigail appeared from the kitchen door in a rush. "Yes, Mr. Lacey?" she said, standing to attention by his side, but staring at the floor. "My daughter and her good friend will be having a full English breakfast. Is that understood?" "Of course, Mr. Lacey." "Well, get to it." "Mr. Sutton, I apologize for my premature departure last night. I'm a busy man, and something needed attending. I do hope you forgive me." "Of course, Mr. Lacey. And you don't need to apologize to me." "You're quite right, I don't. But let me make it up to you today. I want to get to know you a little better. I'm going to the golf course this morning, and I thought it would be a wonderful idea if you came with us." "Oh, well, you see, I'm not very good at golf. I don't want to embarrass myself." "Don't be stupid. None of us are professionals. You're not turning down my invitation, are you?" No, it's not that. It's just my dad said golf spoils a good walk." "Your dad sounds like an idiot." "Father, please," said Elizabeth. "It was a joke. Of course he's a good man. He has a good son to show for himself. Come on, a round of golf. I can pick at your brains, without the distraction of my daughter." "How can I say no?" "You can't. Oh, and Dwight will be coming too. My apologies," said Mr. Lacey, closing his paper. Before I knew it, I was on some fancy golf course looking down one of the most beautiful fairways I had ever seen. I felt overwhelmed. I looked back at two millionaire gentlemen, waiting for me to embarrass myself, and wondered, how did I get here? "Don't mind us, Sutton. Just one thing. Are you really not going to use the driver? I really recommend you do. You need to be up the fairway for this one." "I need to hit the thing first, Mr. Lacey." Behind them was Dwight, with his usual disgruntled teenage face. He looked at his father and his friend, with frustration and want. I hit the ball, and to my surprise, it went quite well. It landed on the fairway, but was still a great distance from the green. The two men took their shots with drivers and got close to the green. Both shots were sublime. Dwight took his last. I think he felt obliged to use the driver like his father. He couldn't hold it and sent the ball flying left into the rough by some trees. Mr. Lacey sighed with disgust and looked ashamed. It was a nice morning as we made our way down the fairway. I was a little behind the gentleman, and Dwight chose to walk a little behind me. As I turned to Dwight, I felt a little sorry for him. That chewing on a wasp expression that was there as he scowled. I thought it was interesting how he chose to walk behind us all, like he thought that was his place. "Unlucky, Dwight. Sure the next one will be fine," I said, with an encouraging smile. He looked at me for a second, then away. As I turned back around, I could hear Mr. Lacey and his friend talking. They spoke quietly, but the wind carried their voices to my ear. "See the receptionist," said Mr. Lacey's friend. "Tasty. Indeed. You see how rosy her cheeks were. Her skin glowed. Imagine presenting her as a gift," said Mr. Lacey. The two men looked over their shoulders at me. They stopped talking and continued their walk, leaving me to wonder what the hell they were talking about. We played more golf. Mr. Lacey and his friend were astonishingly good. The day had warmed, as the cool morning air floated away into the hills. On hole 7, a man approached from behind us. He was playing alone. He was a little overweight, in a blue shirt and beige chinos, and his hair was grey and curly. "George, how do you do?" he said, taking off his golf club and shaking his friend's hand. So I first thought, I noticed, they actually shook hands by each other's elbow, resting their forearms on each other. I then realised Mr. Lacey and this friend George had done it too, but it hadn't occurred to me at the time. "Where have you been, Merryweather?" said George. "France, the Marseille sector. Has it been? The spoils as delicious as they say?" "Oh yes, that Mediterranean sun does something. I tell you that, old boy. You will have to try it out sometime." "Perhaps, but I believe it's probably novelty. Our English sector is regarded as the greatest. Easy to overlook it when you're constantly there." "Maybe you're right, old boy. I have missed it. Well, I will be back tomorrow. Fantastic to hear." said George. At that moment, after a small pause, they all simultaneously looked at me. Who's the fresh meat? This is Saturn, a friend of Elizabeth's. Elizabeth? How is she? Asked Merryweather, with glowing eyes. Blood is great, said Mr. Lacey. Excuse me? I said, interrupting. Mr. Lacey looked at me with glowing eyes of his own. There was an intensity. It screamed internally. I said she's bloody great. Don't you agree, Daniel? If you want to be in our conversation so badly... Oh, yes. Sorry. Is he ready yet? Said Merryweather. Patience, said Mr. Lacey. Well, gentlemen, if you don't mind, I'm going to skip ahead of you and miss this hole, said Merryweather. So soon? Said George. Fortunately so. I have a few things to sort out before this afternoon, but don't worry. You'll be seeing me at the lodge in 2 days' time. Wonderful, said Mr. Lacey with a slow smile. Later, I was back at the mansion. Me and Elizabeth had eaten a light lunch, and we laid on her bed with the TV, but not really watching it. It was just wonderful being with her. Her head rested on my chest, and my free hand played with her hair. I thought of little, and tried to enjoy the splendour I found myself in. But Mr. Lacey kept creeping into my mind. There was something very strange about her father, something I couldn't quite work out. What I said next to Elizabeth was probably working on a subconscious level, digging for information without realising it. Elizabeth, I've seen a picture of 2 girls around the house. Who are they? I asked. Oh, I think you mean my sisters. Where are they? America. Which part? I don't know. Really? Yeah. Why'd you ask? Just wondering, I said, staring at the ceiling. We fell out some years back. I say we. They actually decided to leave. Packed up and went. I think Father pushed them away. Really? Yeah. They haven't called for years. If that's what they want, then good riddance, she said. Have you ever tried to contact them? I'm the little sister. They can get in touch with me if they want. Obviously they don't want to. I think it's rather sad. Maybe one day you should try, I said. Well, I don't want to talk about them anyway. The sun began to turn orange and make its way behind the mountains. Elizabeth told me that the night before we would be dining at the main table. I showered and changed into my shirt, and 15 minutes before we were due at the table, I took the opportunity to look out the window at the lake, from the bedroom window. It was almost dark, and everything looked grey. It was a quiet night, and the water was still. And then I saw something peculiar. Below me, someone walked up the garden, towards the lake. The strange thing was what they wore. A large grey robe with a hood pulled over their head. They looked like a druid crossed with the Grim Reaper. They approached the lake shore, and there was a small rowing boat waiting. Just beside it was a wooden pier. As the figure turned, I hid behind the curtain. The door opened behind me. Elizabeth stood there in a black dress. Father won't be joining us tonight. He's busy, said Elizabeth. "16. Mrs. Lacey and Dwight were sitting there eating soup. They both had a glass of white wine in front of them. Behind, near the kitchen door, I could see Abigail and Frederick. They whispered to each other, and even moved a little. I think I saw Abigail even smile. Come, come, relax, join us, said Mrs. Lacey, who was wearing a blue dress. It was astonishing to see how dressed up Elizabeth and her mother was, just for an evening meal in their own home. How did the golf go, Daniel? I hope my son and husband wasn't too hard on you. I took a seat. It was most enjoyable, I said. Good. Did you have an equally good time, Dwight? He looked over the spoon he sipped on and didn't reply. It was then a bowl of soup was put in front of me and Elizabeth by Abigail. I made an effort to look at her face, and I noticed her lip was swollen. It looked extra disgraceful, because she looked so sweet. I tried the soup. It was tomato and herbs, and flavouring was sublime. It had a pepper kick to it. I watched Elizabeth butter some bread and dump it into her meal. That surprised me, and that I wondered if she would do that if her father was present. "Did you and Dwight talk much this morning?" said Elizabeth. I looked at Dwight, who looked like he wanted to kill me. "Unfortunately, we didn't," I said, sipping a little wine. "Was my husband hogging the limelight?" "No, not really," I said. "Oh, what was the problem then?" said Mrs. Lacey. "I think Dwight doesn't like me much." "Excuse me," said Dwight, letting go of his spoon, letting it drop into his soup. "Well, you don't appear to like me." "You stare at me with a hatred," I said, with a surge of honesty. The family members looked at each other with surprise. There was even a peculiar smile from Mrs. Lacey. "You don't hate Daniel, do you, Dwight?" "I suppose not. I have no reason to hate him." "So why do you think Daniel feels this way?" "I don't know." "You don't know? Come on. Think about how you have acted towards him. Have you welcomed him?" "No, not really." "Why is that?" "I don't know," said Dwight, raising his voice. The two servants stopped whispering behind us, and everyone watched as Dwight breathed heavily. "Remember what your friend said at your last meeting? About you not socializing enough?" "Sure. I think me and your father need to take a certain amount of responsibility for that. We shielded you from the normie world. Homeschooling may not have been such a good idea, but you're an adult now. You can't live under our protection forever, can you?" said Mrs. Lacey. "Mother, please. There's no reason to embarrass me. I don't want to, but we have an opportunity here. I would love to see you and Daniel spend a little time together. How about tomorrow morning?" "Mother, can we stop making decisions for Daniel? I expected it from father, but not you," said Elizabeth. "Would you have a problem with that, Daniel?" asked Mrs. Lacey, as I looked into the psychotic eyes across the table. "Of course not. Of course we can do something tomorrow," I said, grinning. "Great," said Mrs. Lacey. "You should go on a walk together." "How well do you know the lakes, Daniel? There really are some beautiful places here." "I used to come here a lot as a youngster. I love it," I said. "Oh, good, good. Maybe you should go on Striding Edge. One of my favourite walks," said Mrs. Lacey. "I haven't said yes yet," said Dwight. "Come on, please, for me. I would love to see you spend some time with someone near your own age," said Mrs. Lacey. "I haven't brought much hiking gear, though," I said. "Don't worry, you can borrow some of mine," he said. "Thanks, Dwight," I said, as he looked at me with a hideous smile. "That's all well. Abigail, prepare the main. I'll call a toast to good times," said Mrs. Lacey, as all glasses collided lightly. "Huh, it looks like everybody's trying to steal my guest," said Elizabeth. "Sorry, darling. I guess that means it's my turn next, right, Daniel?" said Mrs. Lacey, winking at me. Me and Elizabeth had eaten plenty of food and drink and our share of wine. We laid in bed together in dark. Her skin felt clammy against mine as she breathed deeply, and we climaxed at the same time. We didn't speak. More was said than any words could. I kissed her on the head. She knew what I was saying, but I said it anyway. "I love you," I said, "to destroy or create a world." "You too," she said, kissing my neck. She fell to sleep, and I drifted out the room. I looked out at the lake. It seemed so still, so dark. To my right was the large island, and upon it I could see a flickering light. I wondered briefly who must be there. I wondered about the person in the cloak who had entered the lake on that little rowing boat early that evening. "17. Elizabeth drove me and Dwight and dropped us off at the foot of the mountain with a smile and a wave. I turned to Helvellyn and instinctively smiled myself, but as I turned to Dwight, I felt a little uneasy. The constant frowning had disappeared. Now there was a glimmer in his eye, a slight mysterious optimism. I'm not sure which made me feel more uncomfortable. "Straight up it then, Striding Edge it is," said Dwight. We began our trek on a quiet day. Not many people were around, and a blue sky surrounded us, but the air was cool. We climbed and made comments about the scenery. Soon, we was at the top of Helvellyn, taking in the beautiful surroundings. Then we looked out at the rocky passage. A narrow bridge with steep declines left and right. Slip either side was almost certain death, which happened to several people every year. To the left, in a valley, was a body of water called the Red Tarn. "Come on then," said Dwight, heading onto the edge. I walked about 6 feet behind him, watching my step. "Daniel, sorry about how I stared at you when you first arrived. That was unfair." "You don't have to apologize," I said. "Do you think my father's weird, mate?" he said, echoing my vernacular, a transparent attempt to mirror me. "Of course not, I barely know him." "Me neither," said Dwight. "Why is that? If you don't mind me saying, you seem hostile towards each other." "Father's hostile towards everyone of the outside world. He won't let me into his inner circle. He says I'm not ready. He said I might never be ready," said Dwight, looking into the distance. "His friends. You met 2 of them at the golf club. They hold so much power around these parts." "I guess that comes with being rich." "I don't mean petty material power like that, you idiot," said Dwight, glaring at me over his shoulder. "I mean power like you couldn't understand." "Like?" "Even if I could tell you, you wouldn't believe me," said Dwight, sighing. "Fair enough." "Ha! Just like that. Some people." "Dwight, do you like your father?" I asked. It took little time for him to answer the question, staring over the cliff. "More than anything, I suppose. He just," I watched Dwight close his eyes, "refuses to like me." "I'm sure he loves you, Dwight, in his own way." "He doesn't. He's told me." "Really?" "Oh well. I will show him one day he was wrong about me. He thinks I'm weak. I'm not weak, Daniel. I have moments. Sometimes I do wonder if it'd be better to end it all." I noticed then how close his feet were to the edge, and I looked at him, and his cheeks were wet. When did he start to cry? "There's a lot of world out there, mate. Maybe you shouldn't just concentrate on your father." "That's easy for you to say. I bet you have friends. You have my sister. Who would want me? Go on, admit it. You think I'm a freak." "Of course I don't." "Sure. What did you think of my shotgun?" "Nothing." "Liar." "I'm starting to think you're an attention seeker." "What?" "You're playing a role, psychotic, to get your attention you desperately seek." "Fuck you," said Dwight. There was a silence as we let the cool air and family of hikers pass. "Sorry, Dwight. I just want to be honest with you. I just think it would be healthy for you to concentrate on other things, not your father." "Like?" "What do you like doing?" "I don't know. Sightseeing." "Well, concentrate on that then. Maybe painting." "What? Painting?" "Yeah, you're in the perfect place to try such a thing." Dwight just looked at me in the silence, one of slight understanding. Strangely, the profanity broke some kind of ice. We continued our walk over Striding Edge and talked. He loosened up, and at the top we sat beside each other and looked out at the glorious views. We could see for miles, and it felt fantastic. I asked Dwight if he had some binoculars I could borrow, as I like sightseeing too. He said he had some at home, and I could happily borrow them. 18. Dwight lent me a little pair of silver binoculars and a shirt too small for him that evening. I thought it was a very nice thing for him to do. It was a white one with black buttons, and I thought it had quite the appeal. That night we sat around the table in candlelight. The orange flames flickered, now on red candlesticks, and Mr. Lacey didn't look at anyone as he ate his steak, sitting in a black shirt. "Me and Daniel had a great morning on Helvellyn," said Dwight, the first words anyone had spoken since we all stood and said hello to Mr. Lacey. He stopped eating his steak, and we all noticed. Rather brave this evening, aren't you? Said Mr. Lacey. Sorry, Father. I just thought, what happened when speaking when spoken to? Apologies, Father. Apologies? You're about 20 years late, said Mr. Lacey, returning to his steak. It felt somewhat of a struggle to swallow in the silent room. As we came to finish our meals, Mrs. Lacey broke the silence. Where's Abigail? Abigail's services have been fulfilled, said Mr. Lacey. Could I please hear some words from my daughter? The rest of my family is uttering nothing but irritation tonight. Of course, Father. What would you like to hear about? Tell me about your day. Have you been out? You're simply glowing. I just walked around the garden, actually. That's all. I see. You have such a natural glow, don't you? You have a pleasure that grows every year, said Mr. Lacey, gazing longingly over the table at his daughter. Father, you're drooling, said Elizabeth. Mr. Lacey picked up the napkin from beside him and dabbed at his chin. Forgive me, it's just this steak. It's so tasty, delicious. You know, I've wondered for many years now, Mr. Lacey said, looking hypnotized, his eyes blurred at Elizabeth, and suddenly he shook his head. No, not quite yet. Father, is everything okay? Of course. Fine. What time is it? Almost 8:50 p.m., sir, said Frederick the butler, alone by the kitchen door. Indeed. Well, I must be going. Good evening. Mr. Lacey mechanically touched his lips with his napkin, stood up, and walked out the room. Could I be excused for a moment? I said. Of course. You can do what you want now that idiot's gone, said Mrs. Lacey. I hurried upstairs, towards the bedroom, and looked out the window and reached for the silver binoculars I left on the floor. For the first couple of minutes, I saw nothing, except the breeze and lake water. Then below, someone walked up the garden in a hooded gown, but this time they had something with them. They dragged a black zipped bag down the garden, towards the lake. I first thought it must be tools. Then I realized it was something else, something lifelike, but dead. I dragged the bag and its contents to the little pier and threw it into the rowing boat. Then carefully, not to capsize the boat, the person got inside and began to row out onto the lake. I watched them methodically move onto the water, moving to the right. With the binoculars, I took a closer look. I couldn't quite make out the face. It was too dark. But then I noticed something else. Another rowing boat. And again. The rower wore a cloak, concealing the face upon the water. I then noticed another, then another, then another. As I took the binoculars away from my eyes, I could see about 10 rowing boats on the lake, all heading towards the island, the one with the building on it. As I laid in bed that night with Elizabeth, I know what I had seen, but how could I turn to her and say I think her father dragged a body to an island and took it to a building dressed in a hooded gown? Could that be true? If I said anything of such, she would think I'm crazy. Maybe I was crazy. I laid there not daring to mention it, not without proof, so I got up and left her room, but instead of going to my own, I crept downstairs. 19. I made my way through the kitchen in the dead of night and headed down the long corridor towards the room I found Dwight in a couple nights before with his gun. The house was silent, and I turned the corridor light on. I walked down and looked at the watercolour paintings on the wall. Some were of the lakes, but some weren't. I remember one with a man with shackles. He was naked and blindfolded. I looked into the dark office. Enough light crept in from the corridor, revealing both bookshelves and the oak desk. I walked up the desk and looked through the double glass doors into the garden. It was pitch black and nothing could be seen. I switched on the strange-looking lamp. The shade was pale and looked almost leather. It gave me the creeps. I opened the top drawer of the desk and inside was a book. I placed it on the desk in front of me. It was a hardback with no title. On the front was a golden emblem. I recognized it, but I didn't know where from. Then I realized it was on Mr. Lacey's shirt the first night I had met him. It was of a pyramid, and above it was a circle like of sun. On the left of the pyramid, a lizard scaled it, and its tail wrapped around the top of the structure. I opened the book, and there was the title, Dances with Alchemy. Beneath, in larger font, it said, Knights of Elron. I skipped the page and read the first few lines. Mankind suffers as he becomes bestowed by his suffering. He romanticizes it through his art and history. There is nothing honourable about the man. He is a failed experiment of intelligent life, selflessly obsessed with his own importance. In him, there is something special to extract for the purposes of our higher kind. It made no sense to me, and I skipped forward a few pages. There was a drawing of a woman, her arms stretched out, like a diagram, looking like Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. There were lines dotted around her throat, wrists and inner thighs. I failed to see the meaning. I skipped forward again, more diagrams, shapes and arrows. I had no idea what they suggested. I turned a few more pages and examined some more text. The female is the preferable choice. Except during high lunar light, a male should be chosen for the god of Edok. His throat should be slit, and blood to fall upon the tablets of Adam, filling the veins of the sacred rock. What? I whispered gently, as I felt something cold behind me. What are you doing? I turned, and in the lamplight saw a hooded man. He looked down at me and pulled back his hood. It was Mr. Lacey. The whites of his eyes were bloodshot, and he was biting his lip. The glass doors behind him were open, and the cold night chilled me. Sorry, Mr. Lacey. I got lost. I'm sorry. Is this your office? I probably should be going, I said, as he snatched the book from my hand. You went through my desk. No, it was on top here. Don't lie to me. As he said this, his eyes rolled back into his head. I could see the veins pulsating in his neck. What have you seen? Nothing. Who the hell do you think you are? I had no answer. I recommend you pack your things and leave. Do you understand? Of course, Mr. Lacey. If I've overstayed my welcome, I'll be going. Leave this room and never come back, said Mr. Lacey. I smiled. He didn't. I walked out of his office and down the corridor. As I got near the kitchen, I looked back. He was watching me. Back in my room, I was shaking. I looked out the window that now terrified me. It revealed little. As I got into bed, I closed my eyes and recalled. His throat should be slit, and his blood allowed to spill on the tablet of Adam. The next morning, I woke. I went to Elizabeth's room. She wasn't there. The bed was made perfectly, and the room was spotless. It struck me as strange, but I thought maybe she had not wanted to disturb me and gone for breakfast. I went back to my own room and showered, got dressed, and descended the stairs and approached the table. Sat at one end was Mrs. Lacey eating toast. With his back to me, I could see Dwight. Good morning, Mr. Saturn. Come and have a seat, said Mrs. Lacey. As I walked up to the table and pulled out my chair, I looked at Dwight. He looked up at me with shame in his eyes. His eye socket was purple and badly bruised. Where's Elizabeth? I asked, sitting slowly. Didn't she tell you? Said Mrs. Lacey. No, she didn't. Well, she's out with her father and will be most of the day. She didn't say a thing. Mrs. Lacey looked down at the newspaper beside her and licked the end of her finger, turning the page. What is it they are doing? I asked. Just father and daughter things. They do this every so often. It's nothing. What would you like for your breakfast? I'm not hungry, actually. Nonsense. You can't go without breakfast. What are you having? I'll have a little toast and coffee. Splendid. You heard him, Frederick. Yes, Mrs. Lacey, said Frederick, heading into the kitchen. What happened, Dwight? I said. He didn't look up and answered in a muffled voice. Father gets angry, he said. I looked at Mrs. Lacey, and she continued to read the paper. I sat there perplexed, unsure what was happening. My toast and coffee arrived, and as Frederick put them down, he scowled at me. Mrs. Lacey, do you know when Elizabeth will be back? Oh, Daniel, please relax. It doesn't look good for a man to be lost without a woman. Not attractive at all. It doesn't do any good to spend too much time with anyone. Relax. She'll be back at some point. I ate my breakfast in complete silence and returned to the room I was staying in. I laid on the bed in the morning light and it shined upon me. Time felt long and drawn out, all the way until mid-morning. It was all made worse by all kinds of disturbing thoughts. I tried to banish the idea of anything too ludicrous from my mind, but laying there in a silent room doesn't do much to keep anyone from worrying thoughts. Midday was approaching, and I could lay for no longer. I walked out the room and down the landing. There were paintings on the wall of landmarks of the Lake District, and then I came to a photo. It was a family portrait. It looked about a decade old. I knew because Elizabeth and Dwight were just children in it. The family stared at the camera, and not one of them smiled. That included the two mystery sisters, who looked like nuns. The missing sisters had long, perfect, straight dark hair. Husband and wife stood centre, and Mr. Lacey held a golden chalice and had on what I could only describe as a royal blue cape on. In the upper right-hand corner there was a watermark. It was of a gold pyramid with a lizard scaling it and its tail wrapped around it, the same one as in Mr. Lacey's book. I kept walking until I came to an open door. I looked in, and there was Dwight. He sat on a bed with his back to me, looking out the window towards Lake Windermere. "Go, Daniel," he said. I didn't linger. I knew whatever demons he had, I couldn't fix. I walked back and headed down the stairs. I walked away from the dining room and headed into what appeared to be the living room. It was huge. Mrs. Lacey was laid on a red leather sofa, and her back was to me. I walked on the wooden floor till I came to a huge blue Persian rug. I could then see Mrs. Lacey eating grapes. "Is that you, Frederick? Come back here. I'm bored," said Mrs. Lacey. "It's me, Mrs. Lacey. Daniel," I said. She turned, and I noticed a glass of white wine on the table in front of her. "Oh, I see. Well, you will do just fine. Come, take a seat. Talk to me for a while." I walked in and sat on a red leather sofa adjacent to hers. The only thing separating us was a coffee table with a bottle of wine upon it. "Would you like a glass?" she said. "I shouldn't. That's why you should, Daniel. Allow a little chaos into your life," she said, pouring. "Well, thank you. No, thank you. The pleasure is mine. Sitting opposite a handsome young man like yourself is a rare privilege these days," she said. I smiled weakly and sipped the wine. I am no expert, but it was delicious, and even though it wasn't quite midday, the flavour said everything was okay. "Do you like living here, in the countryside?" I said. "What makes you ask that?" she said. I looked at her almost naked legs. They peered out of a small skirt. Her skin defied her age. "I don't know. Something tells me you want life at a faster pace," I said. Them days are gone. I prefer the slower pace now. But things can be pretty damn good, even going slow." "I'm sure they can," I said. "Thank you, Daniel. Mrs. Lacey, I don't mean to intrude, but Elizabeth? You said she wasn't going to be long." "That's correct. And your husband? What do you think of him? Honestly," I asked. "He's my husband, Daniel, and look at what he provides. How does he treat you? That black eye he's given Dwight, you consider that normal?" I asked. "Well, Dwight can be very challenging at times, you see. He has emotional problems." "Sure. But punching people in the face isn't a way to deal with them. Dwight sees a counsellor. It doesn't seem to do much good, though. I think his father's tough love is a necessary evil sometimes. Anyway, shouldn't we be talking about my daughter? You seem far too interested in my son," said Mrs. Lacey, taking a big gulp of wine. I was just taken by surprise by the black eye at the breakfast table. Well, Dwight doesn't really get on with his father. I think it's fair to say Elizabeth doesn't get on with me. It's like that in a lot of families, you know. You and Elizabeth don't get on? Can't say I noticed. And she hasn't said anything to me. I doubt that she would have. She has her reasons, said Mrs. Lacey, drinking more wine. They are? I don't want to talk about it. I'm bored of this conversation. Tell me about you. Can you just tell me one thing? Where might Elizabeth and your husband be? I asked. Do I hear jealousy in your voice, Mr. Saturn? Of course not. Well, I think I'm the only one that has a reason to be jealous. What does that mean? You know what I mean. I heard you and my daughter and the things you were up to the other night. Don't worry, it's fine. In fact, I'm happy. I could tell she was having a good time. She said, drinking more wine and pouring me some more. Don't you worry about Elizabeth. She's doing fine. They'll be joining us for dinner tonight. I'm certain. You can ask her all about her day then, said Mrs. Lacey. 21. The afternoon was one of the longest of my life. I looked from the bedroom over the lake as the sky turned orange and red after sunset. Elizabeth wasn't home. It was 7:45, and I had arranged with Mrs. Lacey to be at the dining table just before 8. I hadn't seen Elizabeth for the duration of the day, and I was at a complete loss. I wanted to see Mr. Lacey and Elizabeth at the table all safe, but I knew he wouldn't be happy to see me. I had outstayed my welcome. My light blue shirt had been brought to me clean by Frederick, and I was wearing it, looking in the ensuite mirror, already beginning to sweat. I went to the bedroom window and looked out. There was nothing really to say. I concentrated on the island with the building upon it, but could see little of interest. Every night I knew Mr. Lacey had left into a little rowing boat and headed to that island. Tonight I would be waiting. I took a watch from my rucksack, so I knew when to leave the table and come up to see him entering the rowing boat. I went downstairs, under the chandelier, and into the dining room. Mrs. Lacey was sat at the table, with an ever-present glass of wine in her hand. Her hair was done up, and she wore a small black dress with white pearls around her neck. She wore silk black gloves that came up to her elbow, and red lipstick that was as vibrant as the candlestick. In between the giant candles was a black vase with white lilies. Frederick wore a black suit and a black shirt. Evening, Mr. Saturn. Come join me, said Mrs. Lacey. I walked to the table and sat on the long side of the table where I had previous. Mrs. Lacey glazed, half-shut eyes paradoxically had an intensity in them. Where are the others? I said, taking a seat. They're going to be a little late, but we don't need them really. I'm sure we'll have fun on our own, won't we? Perhaps, I said with a weak smile. What are you going to drink? Water will be fine, I said. Oh no, not tonight. Tonight's a special night. You will have to drink wine. If I must drink, can I have a beer? So polite, aren't you? Frederick, said Mrs. Lacey, clapping twice. Frederick left, and alone she leant on the table and stared into me. How are you finding this? Said Mrs. Lacey. Excuse me? You think we're strange. They all do, said Mrs. Lacey. Of course not. We're not. We just have our little rituals. What is mankind without rituals and traditions? Without them, he's reduced to a mere beast, said Mrs. Lacey. I guess so. Well, the saying is, there is bliss in ignorance. You know, watching TV, shoving god-awful food in your face, constantly wondering when your next sexual encounter will come. I see little joy in that simple animalistic outlook. Cheap entertainment, cheap food, cheap sex. People are not so different from animals, are they? 3 things they all need. But we don't want to be animals. We want to be superior. We want to be gods. Are you like that, Daniel? An animal? I suspect not, said Mrs. Lacey. Why's that? Because you like to be alone. You value time to think. It's why my daughter approached you in that pub. We've been looking for someone like you for some time. she said, biting her lip. Frederick came through the kitchen door with a slam and planted a tall pint glass in front of me. We will go straight to the main, Frederick. You don't want your soup tonight, do you, Daniel? No, Mrs. Lacey. Good boy. I ate slowly, because it was hard to eat. I looked at my watch. It was almost 8:30. Still, there was no sign of Elizabeth or Mr. Lacey. Don't worry about them, said Mrs. Lacey, as if she was reading my mind. They have been out a long time. Your point? Well, won't you tell me where they are? You know. Excuse me? You're keeping something from me, I said. I'm sorry you feel that way, Daniel, but it's quite the opposite. What do you mean? I want to give you something. Excuse me? Can I give you my trust tonight? Said Mrs. Lacey under the orange glow of the candlelight. Of course. Really? Yes. Frederick, can you please give me and Daniel some privacy? Frederick nodded and left through the kitchen door. Mrs. Lacey looked at me with more intent. She slowly stood up and approached me. Her heels echoed on the floor, and a smile appeared on her face. She sat on the table right beside me. She crossed her legs, and her dress moved upwards on her thigh. I could see a lot of skin very close to me. Do you know how long it's been since a man looks at me the way you do? Excuse me? It's been a very long time. See, my husband, he has his needs met most nights, in other places. And poor me, I sit here all alone, cold. I don't want to be cold any more, Daniel, she said, uncrossing her legs and putting her heel on my seat, taking my hand and resting it on her naked thigh. You said I have your trust, remember? What do you want? She closed her eyes and laid back on the table, all the time keeping hold of my hand. As she did, she placed it between her thighs and pulled me in until my fingers felt wet skin. Try a bit of mother, she said with a hiss. I pulled backwards, but she clung to my hand and it forced her to sit up. Where's Elizabeth? I said. Elizabeth, 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 that's all I ever fucking hear. How about fucking me? She said, wrapping her legs around me and kissing my neck, clawing at my head. I pulled away, struggling against her grip. Please, I need this, said Mrs. Lacey. I pushed her back hard, and her hands fell back, landing on a knife. I stepped back, and we stared at one another. She held up a hand, and we watched blood trickle down her arm. What happened to trust? Said Mrs. Lacey. Please, just tell me where Elizabeth is. You're never seeing Elizabeth again. What? You heard me. She's gone, said Mrs. Lacey, beginning to laugh. She laid back on the table and became hysterical, looking almost deranged. I looked at my watch. It was a couple minutes to 9. I ran out the dining room. I sprinted up the stairs towards the bedroom window. As I overlooked the lake and peered down the garden, there was nobody to be seen. But then I noticed a rowing boat. It was missing. I reached for the binoculars and began to scan the darkness. There was nothing to see. I looked towards the island. It was there. The rowing boat. I could see a hooded man, and there was a figure in white. There was a flash inside the boat, and then I saw horrifyingly clear it was Elizabeth, dressed in a long white gown that reached all the way down from her neck to her feet. She held hands with the hooded man, who held a lantern. He was helping her onto the island. I thought about the missing sisters, the book, the sacrifices, the rituals, and the spilling blood. I quickly looked into the water again. There was more rowing boats, with hooded men, all heading towards the island. I moved out of the room, down the stairs, under the chandelier, through the kitchen, down the corridor, past the paintings, and to Mr. Lacey's office. The double doors were open to the night. The curtains were blowing in the wind. I ran around the desk and into the night, across the wet grass towards the lake. The wind penetrated me. I could feel the waves and hear the night. I looked at the distant island, maybe half a kilometre away. I could see its trees reaching to the night sky like skeleton figures. Through them, I saw a flickering glow. Fire. With a little thought, I took off my shoes and socks and descended into the stinging cold water. 22. The water hurt, really hurt. It's damaging the body deeply, constantly. The cold, the pain remained. About halfway, I began to tire. I looked to the light and the rising smoke. It became a beacon in more ways than one. I swam harder. At first, it was for someone else, but then it became for myself. I needed to climb out the liquid abyss. The last few strides took an immense effort, and I hauled myself into the grass. The water dripped from me, and I planted my hands and knees on stony soil. There was a gentle breeze, but it felt like a knife penetrating my body. I tried to move my fingers, but they felt like concrete, and I struggled to breathe. Somehow, I managed to get to my feet. I looked in front of me, and I could see through the trees in the darkness. There was a great fire, much larger than I thought. As I struggled, another gust of wind hit me. My breathing tried to quicken but stopped. I felt tight, constrained. I took off my shirt. My freezing body couldn't get oxygen. I could barely remember why I was there. Confused and painful, I walked towards the trees, towards the light, as if it held some holy meaning. With what sensibility I understood, I needed to get close to the fire. Barefooted, I walked through the fallen leaves, my elbows in my hands shivering and teeth chattering. As I exited the dense woodland, I barely noticed the men in grey hoods. I stepped forward to the wondering glow of the fire. As my skin felt warm and my skin dried, the sensation eclipsed me, and I collapsed. Like a pilgrim who had come to worship, I was literally stunned. The last thing I remember hearing was men approach me. Then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, I was looking into darkness, the night sky. I was laid on my back, tied down. I tried to move my wrists and ankles, but all I could feel was rope keeping me prisoner. In the corner of my eye was the glow of the fire. I could hear its deep roaring. I could only move my head. I turned left, and I could see the huge grey stone tablets I laid on. From my neck, there was canals, an inch deep carved into the stone. They headed towards the edge of the tablet. Then I heard a man's voice. "We gather here today to pay tribute to the reasons they do not see." They do not see. Echoed a chorus of men's voices around me. Flesh and blood represent the physical being of man. The physical being of man. Flesh and blood is all he is. We, the Knights of Elrond, rise above the being of man. The being of man. Permanence is our purpose, to dominate the physical world. Through our practice through the ages, we show nature we are the lords of our destiny. Take your goblets, and with it, we pray. The men went silent, and all I could hear was the crackle of fire. Then I shouted, "Who are you? Where's Elizabeth?" But there was only silence. I pulled on the rope, but I was bound tight. It was hopeless. I heard the sound of feet approaching me. Closer they got, until I looked up at 8 men in hoods, looking down, gathering together. Their faces lit by fire, all pale, sickly, with disgraceful smiles. "What are you doing?" I said, as they slowly began to laugh. I then noticed Mr. Lacey. He didn't smile. He was just licking his lips. I noticed the golden goblet he cupped in his hands. "What are you doing, Mr. Lacey? Where's Elizabeth?" But there was no response. Then, above my head, continued the man who had been speaking. "For when we consume, we are greater beings. At that moment, we are scientifically and philosophically your God and universe. We are God, we are universe," they said, raising their golden cups. They all then crouched and disappeared from my view, except for the one behind me. From his rope, he pulled down a small blade and began to admire it. "Oh God, please, no, please," I pleaded. "Shh," he said, bringing the blade to my neck. "23. There was a flash, followed by the loudest sound I had ever heard. My hearing disappeared, and so had the man with the knife. As my hearing came back, I began to listen to screams. Men's screams, noises I thought impossible. Then there was another flash and an explosion-like noise. Liquid spilled upon me. I looked down and saw blood everywhere. The screams got louder, and then another bang and a flash. I lied there in shock, listening to the whimpering and crying. I closed my eyes and waited for the inevitable end. Then I felt the rope on my wrist move with a cutting noise. I didn't dare look, but my left hand had come free, and then my right. They worked in silence, and then my feet were free. Full of fear, I opened my eyes and sat on the stone tablet. On the ground was the hooded men. They laid mostly still, body parts scattered around them. A man's arm was near the fire. One man struggled more than the others. He looked up, his face entirely red. "They deserve it," came a voice from behind me. I looked back. It was Dwight with his shotgun. "I don't know who they think they thought they were. So high and mighty." Dwight looked past me at his massacre. "Sorry, Father, but he chose not to love me. I hope the last thing that went through his head was how brave I am." Dwight dropped to his knees and put the gun under his jaw. I looked away and only heard it. Then the sound of a body collapsing onto the ground. I walked away. I couldn't bear to look for another second. I didn't know where to go, but I saw an old circular stone building, 100 feet away. With nowhere else to go, I headed towards it. I couldn't see much in the dark. The building had pillars framing the entrance, and I could see it had been maintained as if someone still lived there. A small security light shone outside, revealing vague details. The front door was slightly ajar. I crept forward and walked in. There was a large room entirely dark, except for a lone light coming from a lamp on a desk beside the stairs. The room was dirty, and the floor just concrete. In the middle of the room, someone sat alone at a table. The only reason I could see them was because they was wearing a white gown. "Daniel, is that you?" "Elizabeth!" I ran into the dark and kissed her. As we embraced, she began to cry. "I heard gunshots. What happened?" I tried to speak, but I couldn't. I almost collapsed, and she put the chair she'd been sat on behind me. She then looked at me properly, in the lamplight. She could see blood on me, and she could see the horror in my eyes too. "My God, what happened?" said Elizabeth. "They're all dead." "What?" said Elizabeth. "All of them. I don't understand. How are you here?" "They put me here and told me not to move. I was scared." "Who are they?" "They call themselves the Knight of Elron, Elizabeth. You must know something." "Daniel, please, calm down. I know nothing. My father, he asked me to come on a boat trip. That's all. All these weird men in hoods were there. I was so frightened." "Why'd you dress like that? In a white gown?" "What? Oh, I don't know. Just clothes. Did I hear gunshots?" "Yes." "How?" "Elizabeth, it was your brother." "Dwight? What do you mean?" "They were going to kill me, and then there was an explosion. It was your brother with his shotgun. He killed them all and set me free." She began to cry again and rested her head on my lap. "What are we going to do?" said Elizabeth softly. "At sunrise, we head back," I said. We sat in the corner of that building and waited till sunrise. We spoke of nothing. As we headed into the light, I could see in the distance the stone tablet. "Elizabeth, we need to find a rowing boat and head back. But when we get close to there, you can't look. Promise me you won't look." "I promise," she said, holding my hand tightly. We walked into the woodland. She kept her head down, looking at the leaves, and I put my arm around her. We made our way to the water and headed to her father's rowing boat. We began to move away from the island, and I looked at Elizabeth in the morning light. The sky was turning blue, and her white gown seemed so perfectly clean. her hair so fine. Elizabeth always looked beautiful, but as she sat there shivering, she seemed colder to me. In the night, I'd wanted to ask her about her father and her brother, but she had said nothing. "Elizabeth, are you okay?" I said, halfway across the water. "Fine," she said, not looking at me. We made our way to the little pier at the back of her garden. We stepped onto the garden, and I walked behind her, and from the kitchen window, her mother looked out at us in horror. We walked into the house through a little door into the kitchen. "Dear God, what's happened?" said Mrs. Lacey. Elizabeth dropped to her knees and began to cry, like nothing I'd ever seen, as her mother stared at me. "Mother, the Knights of Elron are dead." "What?" screamed Mrs. Lacey. "Dwight, he murdered them, Mother." Mrs. Lacey swiped at the worktop and took the kitchen knife. "The sacrifice must be made! The sacrifice must be made!" screamed Mrs. Lacey, beginning to run at me. "Kill him, Mother! Kill him!" screamed Elizabeth, on her knees. I ran out the kitchen and under the chandelier, out the front door. I ran down the driveway upon the cold concrete stones and completely ignored everything except my escape. I ran into the road and the car nearly hit me. It braked and swerved as I ran instinctively towards Bowness. As I ran, cars occasionally passed me. I must have looked like a madman. I kept running until I came to a grassy opening that led to the lake. I passed a couple of benches and got into the water. The beautiful lake now had a deeper, disturbing serenity. From where I was, I could see the island in the corner of my eye, but I didn't want to focus on it. I splashed cold water over my body, washing away the remnants of blood. After a minute, I continued down the road. Soon on my right, a road led to a caravan park. It was very early hours in the morning, and I walked into the park. I stayed close to the trees and headed towards the holiday homes. I saw a few people preparing for the day, but I kept my distance, and I found what I needed. They hung from a washing line, and at the door was a pair of muddy walking boots. I crossed the grass and snatched the t-shirt and muddy boots. With my new possessions, I went back towards the trees and changed into them, and headed back out onto the road. After half an hour of jogging, I approached Bowness. People looked at me a little strangely. I looked a little rough, to say the least. I passed backpackers and people with their dogs and headed through the village, not approaching the lake that once had meant so much to me. I walked to the train station and was waiting on the platform. It was 8:45 a.m, and only one other person was there, and they paid no attention to me. When the train pulled away, I went straight to the toilet and locked the door. 24. As I walked the streets of my hometown, I walked slowly, with my head down, unable to concentrate. Everything felt unreal. I walked to Benno's house and could hear voices coming from the living room. They were laughing. I grabbed a glass in the kitchen and poured a glass of water. While drinking it, I could hear football on the TV and again chattering and laughing. The noises seemed ordinary. It was beautiful to me. I went upstairs and left the bedroom door open so I could hear. I collapsed on the bed and fell into the deepest sleep of my life. I woke to a wet pillow. I had drooled. I looked at the clock on the wall. It said 10 a.m. I got up, went for a shower. That gave me new life. I got changed and descended the stairs. I walked into the living room with Benno eating Weetabix and watching the football morning show. "Morning," he said, so normal. It felt exceptional. "All right," I said, sitting beside him. "Guessing you went to see that girl from the lakes again then. How did it go?" "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." 25. A few days later, I found myself in a garden at night. I looked up at the night sky, and no stars shone. As I looked down the garden, a figure approached me, in a hooded cloak. I couldn't see his face. He stood before me and pulled down the hood. It was my dad. "How do you think the Halloween party's going?" said my dad. "Everyone's loving it." "How did the ghost hunt go?" "Not bad. I made a few of them jump," he said. Fantastic, I said. Together, we went back into the house. My cousins were dressed as skeletons and vampires. My aunt was a giant cat, and my dog walked around with plastic horns on his head. I was surprised to see he kept them on. I looked into the large mirror in the living room, and I was Dracula. I smiled at the joy and the ambience in the room. I looked at all my family and watched their joy. It was then I realised where the wonder was.